All right, so I'll get started, folks. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Today's Thursday, so it's a Jordan Peterson Thursday. This particular rule about pursue what is meaningful, I think for me, it's one of my favorite rules. I think it's core of Jordan Peterson's philosophy. His book, Maps of Meaning, is all about this concept. And I'm delighted to have Roger, Claire, host the discussion, and to have Sanjay as a panelist. So over to you, Roger and Claire.
All right. Thank you, Shrikant. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. So today is going to be Rule 7. And the rule is pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. In this chapter, Peterson explores the human condition and how humans may have psychologically developed concepts that shape that kind of where we got our natural moral approach. Essentially, Peterson believes that our morality comes from our biology and how it functioned as an adaptation to the history that we're kind of born into. In exploring that, he'll also explore how we should live and what it is we should strive for while we live. The method that he'll use is he's going to explore several biblical stories as well as modern history in an attempt to lay out a moral structure that points to meaning as one of the main goals. So the first section of this is, and his first attempt is, he tries to first define the more obvious case for expediency, or what he defines as expediency. And that is kind of like your animalistic, natural impulses, all the things that you want that you don't really have to explain when you want them. Like when you say, I want to eat, it's like, why? Because I'm hungry? Well, why? So there's no why there. Like that is what I experience, so that is what I want to do. But yeah, so I'll let Claire and Sanjay, do you guys have any thoughts on this section before I?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that he does kick off with, just to kind of level set, is this presumption, which he's already laid out in the book, that life is suffering. And this is kind of just something that we need to go into the chapter understanding and believing. And he uses suffering in a lot of different ways, right? It is the unexpected of a terminal illness, it is earthquakes, it is famine, it is all of that, and that is just the true human condition. There's no more kind of basic idea. And so what can we do about that, right? That seems to be true for everyone, at least eventually. So what can we do about it? And as Roger said, the easiest thing is to pursue pleasure. Live for the moment, follow your impulses, and this is kind of, an argument that is instinctual. It's been used for millennia, and it really does work. And then, okay, so what is the alternative? He starts to lay us on this path across kind of human history. And how did humans start to come to terms with instant pleasure? And slowly, he lays out the story that humans started to wake up and formulate some patterns in their behavior, started to get into ritual. And slowly, this information is coded in our behavior, leading up into the formulation of stories. And that kind of takes us into the next section on delay of gratification.
And Sanjay, did you have any takeaways from the section or anything you want to hit on?
No, I'm good.
Oh, all right. Yeah, so as Claire kind of noted, he is very heavy on the life is suffering aspect of it. I also think it probably comes from his clinical training, since he is a psychologist, and most people in psychology tend to kind of see everything as reinforcement or punishment, and punishment tends to be quite effective. And most of the time, what we're actually seeking is ceasing of punishment. So if you think about it, when you're hungry, when you eat something, yeah, it feels good, but if you don't eat something long enough, what you're actually getting is more cessation of a feeling. So it's that suffering that you put an end to when you finally do eat, but then that's only temporary until you start to have an uncomfortable negative feeling that makes you want to eat again. And hunger is just one aspect of that. Life is full of different things that negatively propel you forward. And yeah, the only thing I would add is that he does start this idea of the Eden myth, the Adam and Eve myth, as the idea of humans, as Claire said, waking up and being conscious of our vulnerability, mortality, and weakness. And then kind of this idea of sacrifice comes right after that. And it's a realization that, one, God's favor can be attained and his wrath can be averted with the proper sacrifice. And two, and bloody murder might be motivated among those who are unable or unwilling to commit those sacrifices. And that then brings us to what sacrifice is and the section called the delay of gratification. So I always put subtitles on all of those chapters. From this one, I have how we go from the naked apes to the fearless Socrates. And yeah, like Claire, did you have any takeaways? I don't want to step on anyone's points.
Start out because there's a lot of we talk a lot about Christianity in this section. And so just to start with those that aren't familiar, really think about these stories as stories. And kind of take off your religion blinders, because I think we all have them in kind of modern days. And so he's really trying to pull out, he's a lot of this, the Adam and Eve kind of Genesis stories, as well as Cain and Abel, to tell stories about the basic human myths much more than actual Christianity. So take those religion blinders off. But he starts to set up the kind of myth of Adam and Eve, and he starts by saying that it makes us, it's one of those first things that makes, in which human story that makes us consider that something might be better attained in the future than in the present. That maybe sacrificing not eating that apple could lead to some rewards in the future. And he makes kind of a beeline here to talking about the necessity for work. And when Adam and Eve are banished for the garden, the necessity for work is kind of placed upon them. And that he says is something that is uniquely human. And that there's little sort of differentiation between sacrifice and work. And we want to kind of define sacrifice here for you guys. Don't think about it as like pain and self-mutilation, but more about that investment toward the future. What are you giving up now in order to reap greater gains later? And so he lays out work here as a sort of a uniquely human mode of sacrifice. And he uses a really great animal analogy here. He says sometimes animals act as if they're working, but they're really only following the dictates of their nature. He says, yes, beavers build dams. They do so because they're beavers, and beavers build dams. They don't think, yeah, I'd rather be on the beach in Mexico with my girlfriend while they do it. So there's this fundamental combination in human nature between work and humanity, and he really wants to kind of call to that.
And yeah, and then once he kind of lays out that case of like, look, this idea of work and this idea of, more importantly, sacrificing is what he equates to a conceptualization of our existence through time, right? It's the idea that I'm going to put in or do something that is difficult, hard, or that I just don't want to do in the hopes, or not even in the hopes, in the expectation that something better will then happen in the future. And what he says is like, the weird part is actually true and works. And then he points out that the second thing that's interesting is that as we start to do that, we also have to start to learn that we can control our impulses, that we should control our impulses, and we should work together with people around us, because that is what would then allow us to that's the prerequisites for organizing society. But then he points out, well, there's this weird thing where we need to both organize society, which requires that we have this conception of the future. But then the conception of the future seems to only be possible in a situation where society was already protecting a place where you wouldn't have to work, where you could already predict that you would have a future, because otherwise, why even invest in something like that? So he kind of points this strange thing, which we can come back to later. Yeah, but go ahead.
The animal metaphor here is wolves and lions, right? That when they kill an animal, they're not thinking, oh, I should put this thing on ice so I can eat it next week. They're in survival mode, and so they're eating as much as they can immediately. And that's sort of the transition that humans went through from an evolutionary biology perspective, is when we had these, what does he call it? The future mammoth becomes the future popularity and personal reputation. So that transition from, hey, if I saved this, what potential gains could come in the future. And he is really trying to kind of bring us back to an evolutionary biology case for sacrifice.
Yeah, and this is also where he's kind of starting to build out this fiction. He points out our ancestors, here's a real quick quote, our ancestors acted out of fiction. They personified the force that governs fate as a spirit that can be bargained with, traded with, as though it was a human. And it's like, well, where would that come from? Why do we conceptualize, for example, God as he? It's like, well, why would a transcendent, all-knowing, all-being entity need a gender? And one of the things that Peterson points out is like, well, if you can imagine an archaic man or an archaic person living through time, when they conceptualize the future, and this is kind of from Jung's idea that anytime you want to conceptualize something novel or new, you can only ever use the things you already have. Like there's no other source of information outside of the information you understand. And he says like, well, what's the future? Well, the future seems to be a network of people that know you, that are interacting with you now, and likely will be the ones you're interacting with later, that are constantly keeping account of your actions. And it's like, well, what's a symbolic representation or a symbolic abstraction of that? It's like a judgmental father, right? Like that, in the same way you would act towards a judgmental father is the exact same interaction you normally would have with society as a whole. And so that's where, for Peterson, you start to get this idea of a masculine judgmental being that is that if you listen to, you are rewarded with. If not, you are punished. And yeah, we're going to go to something.
There's a God element there too, right?
Right. Yeah.
There's a religious element. But I mean, I think it gives a much more case to the origin of religion than anything else. That judgmental father is also ourselves. It is us. It is the logos. And I think it is sort of it's a scary symbolic idea, but if you come to respect that symbolic father, I think it's a good one to keep in the back of your mind.
Right. So it is the idea of God, but the thing that's always important to remember for Peterson that I think, if you're not very familiar with how he talks about this stuff, it can get really confusing. For Peterson, God and reality are almost the exact same thing. So in other words, how people conceptualize reality was by personification of a myth that then allowed them to conceptualize it as though it was a masculine figure that judges, because the reality functions similar to how a masculine figure would act in an abstract form. And from there, because once that relationship gets established, Peterson points out, well, then two questions naturally arise from that. One is, what must be sacrificed? And the second one, because we're naturally human and we want to know how good things can get, how good might the possible future be if the most effective sacrifice could be made, right? And then before he goes to that, he kind of points out the Cain and Abel story. And it's like, look, the truth of the matter is sacrifices don't always work. In fact, sometimes they don't work at all. And whenever that happens, it can be very easy, and it's the conditions of life itself, to become extremely bitter and resentful. And it's like, and Cain is like we covered, I think it was in the last chapter, is the epitome of exactly those emotions of when you feel like you've done everything right and you're still just getting screwed by life, right? When you feel like you deserve more than what life has given you, and you start to hold it against existence itself, right? And it's a everyone's been there. Everyone's had a situation where you thought you earned it and you felt like you did everything you could to get something, and then it's taken away from you because of some arbitrary or unfair rule. And in the story, God says, it's like, well, that's not that's your problem, is you actually didn't do hard enough. You didn't even try hard enough. You could have done more. And naturally, that's almost always the case with all of us, right? We could always do more. There's always a potential for something better, something more effective. And if you remember from Peterson's perspective, God telling him that is the equivalent of reality being like, yeah, and what you gave wasn't good enough. And like, who are you going to argue with? God? Reality? You're going to argue against that? Like, good luck winning that debate, right? Like, it's like, no. It's like, that is the game you're in, and it's the only game you can play.
And then reckoning with that becomes the human struggle. So asking the question, why isn't God happy? Why didn't I do enough? Peterson says, asking that question is the same thing as thinking. So it's in that process of coming to terms with why your sacrifice wasn't sufficient, that you're starting to measure yourself up against your value and the value of your highest God. And now you're really kind of playing ball and thinking at a level of truth.
Right. And this is where Peterson, and he notes himself, he's like, here's some general idea. Here's a general narrative of how human development happened. And he himself is like, obviously this didn't happen exactly like this, but he's like, it's like these all had to happen and they likely developed in this order. And he says, like, there's the humans we're hunting mammoths, or, a small crew is hunting mammoths. And eventually we get to the point where, like, we'll eat as much food as we can, as all animals normally do. And we collapse, and then we wake up the next day and I'm like, oh, I'm hungry again. And you realize, I was like, oh, there's still mammoths. Like, okay, good note. Later you realize you can store food. And eventually you start to realize, like, well, I should also take care of the people around me. So you start to, you also share some of this. Peterson's more pointing to the fact that at some point in the evolutionary chain, we had to develop these traits. But then once we go from sharing to our own kin, the next step is then trading, which is the idea of, like, oh, I have something and I could give it to somebody that I don't know, in the hopes that they'll give me something. And then after that, the final one is, I could give them food now, because I can't use this food anyway, because it's going to go bad and I can't eat that much, and hope in return that in the future, when they have food and I don't, that it'll be returned. Right. And then that's the beginning of reciprocity, is just one postulation that he says. But what he's kind of pointing to there is, once that pattern gets established, and it might not even have been caused how he said it was caused, right? That's irrelevant. Like, he's not really staking much of a claim on that. He's just kind of setting up the different process. But once that process of trading happens, what humans start to do is we start to observe ourselves, right? If you guys are familiar with the more maps of meaning side of dominance hierarchies, we're constantly attempting to compete to climb up dominance hierarchies. One of the best ways to do that is watch who's doing really good. And we do it all the time, right? That's why we care about celebrities. That's why we care about, like, presidents and rich people, and pretty much anyone on the news likely is on top of some form of dominance hierarchy. And there's a reason you actually bother to watch it. So you're actually attempting to take on behavior and learn from it. But he says, well, once we do that, one pattern starts to really grow. The successful among us delay gratification. The successful among us seem to act as though they're bargaining with the future, right? And that's kind of where you start to get this sense of a hero myth with an ultimate thing at the top that they're negotiating with. I'll leave it at that. I don't want to fall too into the weeds with that. But then Peterson goes further and says, look, once this pattern starts to get noted, the questions start to get more and more complex, right? It's like, okay, well, what can God ask for? What's the things that he normally asks for? And, one of the conclusions is, like, well, sometimes God, or reality, demands that you sacrifice the very thing that matters most to you. And we'll come back to this, but this to me was like the biggest revelation personally. But the idea that God or reality can put you in a situation where the very thing that is most important to you is the thing that needs to be sacrificed for your life to get better, or for God's will, right? In the more Christian tradition of, like, God has a plan for God's will to be enacted. And that, oh, go ahead.
I don't mean to interrupt. The question here is, what is the biggest possible sacrifice? How complex can that get? How big can you get? And he says, well, sometimes things will not go well, but when they don't go well, sometimes it's not the world's fault. Sometimes it's our reckoning with that outcome. And if something isn't matching up there, maybe we need to look at our values and see what needs to be sacrificed to level that out. And that's about kind of letting go of those things that aren't meant to be.
Right.
And it lays out, okay, well, to him, it's a close race between child and self in terms of those biggest sacrifices. But those are far more deeper than just suicide and your child dying.
Right. It's the idea of like, what would be the greatest sacrifice, right? What would be the hardest thing to give up? It's like, well, you could be like money, love, all those other things. Like, yeah. But like, what about the thing that's experiencing it? Like you, right? And then the second thing is like, well, what about the thing, like the child that you created, you know, that your entire job is to protect? Like sacrificing that would be just as hard to do. And points out, well, if you think of the biblical story, and here's one of the reasons why it's transcended, or not transcended, but it's been around for so long and spread so well, and it's what Peterson points out as it being an archetypal story, is that one, Mary, the mother, sacrifices her son, right? And what Peterson points out is like, that's the choice that every single mother has to make, right? And it's a choice of, if I have a child, I know for a fact that the world will tear this child apart. And eventually the world's going to win. The child dies at the end. Everyone does, right? So to create something knowing full well from the start that it's not going to make it, it will die. It's like, that is a sacrifice in a real sense, because that child doesn't need to exist. And then he goes to the next step and he says, look, when Jesus himself is on the cross dying, he has sacrificed himself for the good of humanity, right? For the good of everyone else except him. And at the same time as Christ is making that sacrifice, God is sacrificing his only son, right? And that connection of the two most extreme sacrifices happening at the exact same time within one act is what makes it archetypal. It's a limit case, or at least that's what Peterson believes, is that it's a limit case, and that's why it has such a big impact. And so what the hero myth seems to be, what if you're seen as a hero myth here, then what the hero myth seems to imply is that the person that wants to bring the best of all futures is one that will forego expedience and sacrifice the child himself for the rest of humanity, right? And then, you know, Peterson kind of is like, yeah, but also that's Jesus. Like, who's going to be as good as Jesus? Who's going to presume that level? And he says, like, all right, well, here's a more solid example: Socrates. It's like Socrates. For anyone who doesn't know, I can't remember the emperor that's doing it, but the government really doesn't like that he's teaching kids, and they don't like just that how annoying he is, because he calls himself a gadfly, and he just goes around and just starts arguments and just points out how everyone kind of seems to be wrong and doesn't really seem to understand their own ideas. And at one point, he's put on trial, and the trial is kind of just to scare him away. They're just trying to get him out of, I think, Rome. And he eventually, was it a democracy? I thought they only had a Senate. Sorry, I'm mixing up my point. I haven't read the Apology in a long time. But long story short, sorry, none of this here or there. The whole point is that Socrates is put on trial for corrupting the youth. But the trial itself is kind of more just to scare him away. And he has several opportunities to escape, and he chooses not to. And so he's put to death, and the death is drinking hemlock poison. But the point here is that though Socrates himself considers escaping, the thing that stops him is his daemon, his conscience. And he seems to re-understand his position as one that death may not actually be the worst thing, that death may actually be a liberating thing in the situation that he's currently in, where maybe he's already lived a full life and can totally and fully accept his limited existence and accept the end to it and let it go, let his life go. And for Peterson, this is a pretty big example of exactly what he's trying to find. Because for Peterson, without going too deep into it, Peterson hates a lot of modern theories of how we justify our existence, mostly because there's two main ones he really hates. There's terror management theory, which essentially points out that like you're constantly just trying to avoid the fear of death. So you build all these fake ideas that allow you to go through your life, because if you were to actually look at it, you'd be horrified and would go crazy and wouldn't be able to actually handle the fact that you're just a mortal being and will die eventually. And the second one that he hates is the positive illusions theory. And the idea is like, well, if you just make enough good stories about yourself, then you don't have to worry about death, because once death comes, you'll just be busy thinking about good, nice thoughts. And then, by then it won't matter. And he completely rejects both of those. He thinks both of those are very terrible theories and are very dangerous. And he points to Socrates and to Jesus and several other people, Solzhenitsyn and all of them, as people that were able to stare death without fear and accept it if it was necessary, right? And accept it as an aspect of life that was fully okay, where there was no fear. It was through bravery that they were able to conquer death. And what the case that he makes here is that Jesus did the same thing, and that's the moral of the story. That's why Jesus transcends death at the end of the story, is because he was able to truly accept it. And we can get into that. But before we go any further,
can I add something about Socrates?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Socrates, he's Athenian in Athens.
Sorry. Yeah.
And the thing that he does is that, really the hallmark of Socrates is that he's the first person who begins to question things, question human things. Pre-Socratics looked at the world and tried to figure out the world. Socrates used the same method to question what we do as human beings. So he relentlessly questioned raised questions about religion and ethics and about society. And many people could not handle it. They could not handle it. And that is why, people voted to put him to death. Now, he had the option. He did not consider leaving. He had the option of leaving. His friends were trying to convince him to leave. And his argument was that I will do the right thing. And doing the right thing meant that he would accept to be put to death, because in the long run, he was interested in doing just the right thing. He was not interested in the expedient, but just doing the right thing. So that's how I understand it.
Mm-hmm. And is that from the Apology? From Plato?
There are two sources we have. We have Xenophon and we have got Plato. Both of them, they have slightly different accounts, but in general, that's the basic thing. So, and of course, the famous portrait that hangs in the Met over here. It's the death of Socrates. Yes. Yeah,
that's interesting, because I thought Peterson had said that was because that's why he had listened to his daemon, but I could definitely be wrong. I fully admit that. It's been forever since I've looked at Socrates. And sorry, Sanjay, did you have anything on this section that you'd like to join in or add?
No, I am not as well read on Peterson as you guys are, but I can bring interpretations on what I understand he's saying. So I'll for this section, no, nothing.
Okay.
Cool. I think just to wrap up, because there's a big pivot here at this kind of point. But sort of to wrap this up, he's laid out that life is suffering, and that delay of gratification and sort of active sacrifice and investment toward the future can be an anecdote to that. And then he just so beautifully wraps it up with these archetypal stories and with some human history examples of people that have done that. And I just want to throw in some gender stuff, because there's, I think, some good ones here. The first one is this concept of, is it right to bring a child into the world, is a really common rhetoric now, right? And so I think that that's something that Peterson presses a lot in lectures of, Mary, God coming to her and saying, you're going to have a baby, and then it's going to get murdered, and no one's going to know that it was God's baby. Like going into that, knowing the political system in Rome at the time, like, why would you do it? But I think that there are parallels there that are really interesting. And then the interesting thing with the Socrates section is he ends it saying he took his poison like a man. Peterson says that. And you read that at first and you're like, okay. But I think it was really intentional word choice, and because he's prescribing the masculine, the God, the logos. And so I think when I read that the second time, I was like, I see what you're doing here. He's pushing buttons really intentionally. So I just think it gives me goosebumps the way he wraps up this section with like, boom, the crucifixion story, double whammy, and then Socrates, because like, who doesn't like Socrates? So then he ends it. He's like, okay, life is suffering, but that's not even the worst part. We also have evil and malevolence and human proclivity to harm each other. And that's a really fun thing that we get to wrestle with also. And so this problem of suffering gets much more complex when you add malevolence. And back to the Adam and Eve story, when they're banished, part of the thing that they start to see when their eyes are opened and they're awakened is the differentiation between good and evil. And Peterson says that once we become aware of ourselves, we see our own nakedness, our own vulnerability, then we start to understand what resentment and jealousy and pain means. And then we know how to produce it on others. And again, we're going to bring back Cain and Abel. If somebody, Cain's sort of story, he does everything right. He really tries. Abel tries. They both bring it to God. They've sacrificed what they've done, and it's not good enough for God in Cain's case. And so that experience of having, as we said earlier, sacrificed and done the right thing and still it not being enough, that's the magical potion to resentment. Because then you've lost both present, because you sacrificed it, and future. And that resentment and the pain because of the lost time leads to malevolence. He says that humans are really resilient. We can deal with floods and earthquakes and poverty and cancer. But when we're faced with someone malevolently evil trying to do an act against us, that's really, really something hard for humans to grasp.
Right. And from here, he's kind of going to point to how evil, this where the Jungian in him really starts to shine. And this is where he really goes into the idea of the shadow and why an integration of the shadow is a vital aspect for essentially living, or to be able to actually take these things on, because otherwise it just operates when you're not aware. There's just one quote that for me really helped me really understand the shadow was, before we get into that real quick, I do want to hit the Cain and Abel idea, and the idea that when Cain is basically screwed over by reality, right? He has made the sacrifice, so he gave up the president and doesn't get any reward in the future. And he kills his brother, his ideal, and he does it to spite himself, to spite mankind, and to spite God himself, right? And then Peterson points, and he's like, well, not only in the myth itself, not only does Cain then give birth to Ubermensch, who eventually just breeds more violence, is actually worse, kills more people, but 7 generations later, traditionally speaking, because historically this wouldn't make sense, but through the traditional narrative, to Blue Cain, I can't quite say his name, is the first creator of weapons of war, right? So it's the idea that this base level reality of how the game's set up, that there are instances where you may not get rewarded for the sacrifices that you make, and life may not be fair to you, and it can naturally push you to a place where it becomes fully destructive, eventually also becomes the seed that then gives birth to to weapons of war, in the sense of bronze swords and everything. Essentially, he doesn't quite go too into it, but essentially that is the birth of weapons. And he points out that, yeah, life is rough, but humans are always able to make things so much worse. So from there, we go to Evil Confronted, where Peterson kind of points to Christ as a different approach to evil, because he points out Abel was fully able to sacrifice to God, to keep God happy and pleased, but he had no solution for Cain, which Cain was just malevolence. And for Peterson, he believes that Christ, symbolically speaking, takes that on when he's tempted by Satan in his 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness before he's crucified. Because during this time, he's tempted in three very unique ways by Satan. The first is make the stones bread. Essentially, during this time, Jesus is fasting. He isn't eaten. And this Peterson kind of identifies as that's the temptation of expediency, right? Of those natural urges that we all have. If you've been starving for 40 days and 40 nights, the idea is to evoke, it's like, well, yeah, it would be really hard for me not to just, if I had the ability to not just make food and, eat it. The second temptation is, Satan being, oh, well, if you're really the Son of God, you should throw yourself off that cliff. God will save you, right? And, Peterson lists several reasons, but two of the main ones, one of my favorite was like, he's not about to ask God to do that. Like it's God. You don't ask God to do that. But more importantly, Jesus Christ in this act rejects the very idea of salvation or survival, right? It's like, even if he were to accomplish this and have God prove to Jesus that he is there, it doesn't really solve the actual problem that he's trying to take on, which is for all humanity. And then the last one, which Peterson kind of points to, is like, this is the kind of the strongest one as far as humans go. He says, well, why don't you just take over the world? You're the freaking Son of God. Like, you got superpowers, essentially. Why don't you just make this world whatever you want it to be? And in this, he's being offered essentially everything, right? He's being offered everything that humans could desire is on the table in this one. And Jesus also rejects that temptation. So then what's the myth trying to say? To create the best future, the being must sacrifice all worldly attachments, right? Like you must be able to fully renounce yourself to this cause completely. And the cause being for the betterment of everyone else, for the betterment of reality itself. So, yeah, did you have anything else to add before we go to the next one?
And to put this in religious terms, to establish the kingdom of God on earth, right? So not to wait for that aspiration, but to create that now. And it's all about sort of conducting your life in a matter of rejecting that immediate gratification for something that comes in the future. He's really pulling out this story of Jesus in the desert with Satan as the antithesis to the Old Testament story of Adam and Eve. So here in the New Testament, Satan comes back and Jesus handles it in the right way. Jesus wins. He's able to deny these three, he maintains his sacrifice, he denies these temptations, and he sort of defeats evil and develops that kingdom of God. So that's sort of set up as the archetype of success. It takes a special sacrifice, he says, to defeat evil.
Yeah, and Sanjay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's a very brief saying that really summarizes this part, that something better might be attained in the future by giving up something of value in the present.
Mm-hmm. And here we go past Christianity, because the next section now is Christianity and its problems. And here's where he kind of brings where modern thought starts to creep in, right? And Peterson kind of gives a great summary of this idea of, look, what we need to understand about religion is that when it came to be, it was attempting to resolve and solve a lot of different problems that we no longer really have to deal with. But since we don't have to deal with them anymore, it starts to seem like it didn't have a purpose, right? Like if what I put is like, if a solved problem is an invisible problem, right? It's a problem that we don't even see that we needed a solution for to begin with, because everyone who did suffer from that is already dead. But he points out that it did do several good things. For one, it had an insistence on the divinity of everyone, including slaves and prostitutes. It wasn't just the king or even the people high up in the social hierarchy that were connected to the divine or had some connection to the divine, but it was all of us. And it wasn't restricted to a certain race or people, but it spread to every single being. Women were as valuable as men, although he definitely also notes is like, though they still didn't have, we've still been struggling to enact that politically. It's like, but that the theory itself was being established there. And they separated church and state, with the idea being that even a king is just a man before God, right? All men stand before God, and God is the ultimate judgment or judge of all men, including kings. They were just as humbled by everyone else. So he points out, like, these were three big issues that did happen, that were occurring, that Christianity started to push against. It's like, but by the time Nietzsche comes, those solutions are old, and they're essentially the Osiris from the Osiris and Horus myth, right? They're the old rules that need to be updated. And Nietzsche comes in and delivers some pretty rough criticisms of Christianity. He points out, well, one, if Christian died, then there's nothing to work towards, right? Like if Christ died to save all of humans from and give them lasting life, well, then what's there left to do, right? Like, why care about life at all? It also points out that's like, well, he also in the Bible removes all responsibility from its followers. If you accept Jesus Christ in your life, no matter what you've done, you don't have to deal with any of that. You'll be saved forever. Another one is the church never actually holds anyone accountable for the things that Jesus said they're supposed to do. No one has to follow Jesus' teaching. In fact, like, it's kind of just a pick and choose. And he also points out that there is no value on worldly suffering, right? So everything that's happening in our reality is just, can just be seen as like, this is just like the pre-lobby for heaven. So, just hold out a little bit longer. And he points out that both Nietzsche and Marx had a similar critique in this one, and that is the passive acceptance of the status quo. That, well, if God's in control and we already won the fight against death with Jesus's death, then whatever's happening now, we just got to wait it out. And he points out that these were extremely destructive. In other points, he's also pointed out that this one of the main effects that caused Russia's belief system to really collapse, because Russia was extremely religious. And yeah, before we go anything else, did you guys have anything you want to add about Nietzsche coming in and taking out?
I think you've hit it. It's that, in the formulation of the Christian church, a lot of the burden of Christian morality was lost. And this sort of imitation of Christ was quite lost. And I think you summarized that quite well.
Right, yeah, because it's almost as though in the church it gets so dogmatic and ritualized that the actual hero myth is lost, that it's seen as, I'll just go to the next point, that because he points out that in the Brothers Karamazov, there's the story of the Grand Inquisitor, and the main takeaway from that is that, in that story, for those that don't know it, Jesus comes back, and rather than being taken in as like the savior, because the church still exists and everything, it's he comes in during the Inquisition, and the Inquisitor jails him. And one of the things he says is like, look, man, the things you taught people are way too hard to do. Like, no one can actually do what you told us to do. That's impossible. Like, that's not a human thing. It's like, well, So what we kind of did was, we told them that there's eternal life, and we told them all this, other stuff that made it way easier for them to be able to actually accept, because the standard that you set, that was impossible. We couldn't manage that. And that's kind of pointing at the idea of, like, instead of seeing Jesus as the thing you're supposed to emulate, you see him as the salvation that already did all the hard work for you, right? And that's I think one of the main criticisms, which Peterson points to. Yes, the dogmatic church that creates that structure is like, yeah, there's a fair criticism on there. It's like, but the myth itself still stands, which is what I think Peterson, I think, is why he identifies as a Christian to some extent. Yeah, and so the next point is what Nietzsche then offers as a solution, because once you've kind of destroyed that belief structure, you're kind of not left with much of a direction. And that's one of Nietzsche's main things, and everyone, I'm sure a lot of people here have heard it, is the Ubermensch idea, the idea of, like, we need to become superior beings that can define our own beliefs and create our own meaning within ourselves, and, take on life in that sense. And Peterson here notes that's like, this might be where Nietzsche is kind of like a product of his time, because there wasn't much of a study of psychology, and also it turns out you can't actually impose your own beliefs on yourself, like your own rational conscious beliefs on yourself, right? You can say you'll do that, but your actual behavior doesn't tend to normally follow that. Anything else before we move on?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's kind of a father-son discipline thing here, that it's that self-discipline, right? And that one of the things that Nietzsche appreciates about Christianity is that concept of constraint, and that that's that the necessity of sort of the dogma of the church was implementing that restraint. But he really believes, as you said, that restraint needs to be individual, and that you need to align that. But hey, that's really hard. It's really hard for us to restrain when we do anything. And so let's look to Jung, who really says, take a step back, appreciate your individual values, your strengths and weaknesses, and then start to think about what restraint will look like for you, and develop your value system kind of going forward.
Right. Yeah, because once Jung and Freud both come in, they both kind of point out that's like, yeah, you don't get a choice you don't get as much of a choice as you would think on who you actually are. It's like there's parts of you that are already there. You have a nature. It's like, and it's more your job to figure out what that nature is first, and then from there work with that, rather than just the Nietzschean way of just being like, I want to be this, so I'm going to work my way to be that.
And just specifically, with Jung, it's personalities, right? So what are personality functions? This is when we get into Myers-Briggs and Big Five and all personality tests. So it really is taking the test, really knowing what's your proclivities and others. So just to make that really specific.
Mm-hmm. And Peterson here kind of points out, like, so this next one is the doubt past mere nihilism. And in here, Peterson kind of starts with the story of René Descartes and what he does for extreme skepticism. And essentially, René Descartes is a philosopher that kind of realizes, is like, well, every single thing I've ever believed has always been a lie, right? Like I keep having these beliefs, and they keep getting proven wrong reasonably and rationally. And it's like, well, okay, you know what? I'm just going to give everything up. I'm just going to start from the complete bottom. What are things that I cannot deny? What's something I cannot be skeptical about? And he tries to dig as deep as he can, right? He's like, well, numbers. It's like, well, no, numbers could actually not be true either. Like, it could be that God is an evil genius that just likes messing with people. It's like, well, what about reality? It's like, nah, I could be dreaming, right? Like every single thing, there's a possibility that it could be not what he thinks it is. And he's, eventually just reduces it to the point where he's like, well, there's only one thing that I think I can think, and that is that I am thinking. And that is where he comes up with the idea of cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. It's the one thing I know is that I exist. And the I is the thing that is thinking. And Peterson very points out, he's like, look, I'm not trying to compare myself to him. I'm trying to say that I got to my point of view in a very similar way to that. So that's why he brings it up. But this idea of trying to dig as deep as he can to find bedrock so that he can lay his house on something that's solid. And the idea is like, well, what can't be denied, right? Morally speaking, what can't be denied? And he starts with, it's like, all right, well, we know what bad is, right? We all have a general idea of what bad is, like Nazi Germany, Auschwitz, the gulags. And then he simply asks, like, well, it seems to be that we can really identify that. What would be the opposite of that? And here is where I'm going to skim over this one because, I already gave a talk on it, but also we could go for hours on this. And he gives a short, brief argument for his idea of what God can be or what God can function as. But the idea is basically that of the logos. I can answer questions about it later if you'd like, but I don't want to get to it since we're already kind of running late. But he also points out that, like everything I'm looking at it, I'm like, this is all gonna take forever. Is there any points you want to go into before?
I think this section, the last section is really important. So I think you really hit it.
Okay, well, I'll just quickly, very, very quickly sum it up. So the logos functions as an idea, and as we've discussed in previous talks, ideas function as personalities. And if they function as personalities, that's also, it's things that can essentially take you over. So essentially like, if this seems too abstract, you can think of it as more like memes and how memes are able to, or ideologically possessed, Peterson would say. So like anyone who has an idea, and then it's almost like the idea is a program that is just running in your head. And Peterson kind of views it as getting something that chooses the correct programs is the best way I could describe the logos as the arbiter between those. But that's a whole another thing. But apart from all that, we can also just talk about normalized, universally accepted morality. And he points to Solzhenitsyn's point that he believed that the Nuremberg trials were the most important trials in human history. And essentially what the Nuremberg trials they were the trials after World War II, where a bunch of Nazi concentration camp people were put on trial and were charged with crimes. And one of the points that they were trying to make was, look, because the Nazis' defense was, hey, it's our culture, it's our people. You do things your way in your country. Don't come into our country and tell us how we can treat our people. And what the Nuremberg court, or what was argued at the Nuremberg court, is there are certain red lines that are never under any circumstances acceptable, right? That there are certain things such as putting people who are minority and don't have power in, showers and then gassing them. Like, that's not okay. That's never okay, no matter what, right? That's a moral line that no one should ever cross, no matter your culture or anything else. And that is seen as, for Solzhenitsyn and for Peterson, as proof that there's an actual moral code there that we do actually follow. And it may not be totally defined, it may not be able to be articulated fully, but it can function more within as an idea. And that's probably as clear as I can get now without going way more into it. But so Peterson then points out to, all right, well, what should we be then aiming at? And I'll let you
and so he
start with this.
He aligns that we should aim at meaning as a higher good and as a higher aspiration. And he says, aim up, pay attention, fix what you can fix. Don't be arrogant in your knowledge. Strive for humility, because totalitarian pride man itself in intolerance, oppression, torture, and death. Consider the murderousness of your own spirit. That's the shadow, of course. Maybe it's not the world's fault. Maybe it's you. And above all, don't lie. This gets into truth. Consider then that the alleviation of unnecessary pain and suffering is good. Make that an axiom. To the best of my ability, I will act in a manner that leads to the alleviation of unnecessary pain and suffering. You have now placed at the pinnacle of your moral hierarchy a set of presuppositions and actions aimed at the betterment of being. Why? Because we know the alternative. And of course, he's alluding to the genocides of our time. And so for Jung, whatever was at the top of one individual's moral hierarchy was that person's ultimate good or their ultimate God. That was what the person acted out. And that is that ultimate good that we should strive for kind of over expediency. What else, Roger?
Yeah, and that ultimate good, the idea, the thing that we should aim for most is, because one of the things that Pearson points to, and the reason he mentioned Descartes and the solid rock is, well, at the end of the day, there is one thing you can't deny, and that's suffering, right? Suffering is something that, I don't care if you're nihilistic, I don't care what belief system you have. If I torture you, you're going to do everything you can to not be that, to not be there, right? To not have that experience. So it's like, all right, so that can't be denied. And it seems to be intrinsically not good and not light, right? And it's like, okay, well, then why don't we just negate that? And that should be our moral. Like, the moral should then be, like, the highest moral good that we can possibly imagine is to try our best to prevent as much needless pain as possible. Now, the key word here is needless, because he also points out life is still suffering. There's still plenty of pain to go around, and you will be suffering no matter what. But we can work really hard to not make it worse than the price we already have to pay. And maybe if we act in that way, life may actually present us with meaning. And we can get into meaning that later, but meaning is essentially the things that call to you, the things that intrinsically beckon to you and that appear to only you, essentially. And the idea is you have to first aim at the highest goal that you can think of, and then pay attention to what appears. Because as we mentioned earlier, and what matters, why this all matters with sacrifices, what you actually value, and we've given talks about this before, but what you actually value in your hierarchy, your value hierarchy, determines what it is you can actually perceive, because it is what your brain dedicates resources to actually functioning as. And since our functions function similar to personalities, they have different priorities, they have different ways and frameworks of perceiving the world. Choosing the highest one then highlights the ways to get to that then can become meaningful. So then it's the idea that meaning is all around you, but aiming at the highest one filters it so that you can get meaning while achieving the highest good.
And in contrast to expediency, which he kind of sets up in the parentheses of this chapter, expediency is staying safe and not having to aim. It's staying within order. And when you identify that aim and you've moved towards it, Peterson says you're starting to balance that essential balance between order and chaos. You're putting your foot out into chaos in the right amount necessary, and it's through that beautiful balance that you're starting to develop that meaning. It's kind of the chaos of transformation, the possibility of the newness, and then the discipline of order and, you know, the culture and history of your forefathers. And right in there, if you're feeling just right, boom, you hit meaning.
And yeah, there's just one, there is one final quote I did want to leave us with, but Sanjay, before that, is there anything you wanted to jump in and say about this last part?
I mean, you guys are doing a great job. I mean, I can reiterate things you've said in different ways, but I think aiming for the highest good, that's a very central part of what he's getting at. And especially, I mean, he's talking about how there is evil, and the example of Nuremberg and Auschwitz, all of that exemplifies that very strongly, that, you know, that evil can be defined, or the opposite of good can be defined. And so we get meaning really from working against that and acting toward the best that we can be. On the topic of order and chaos, I think that's interesting. And I mean, the way I look at it is that he thinks that he says that we should be operating between order and chaos. And the way I interpret it is because chaos is really that area where there's no choice. We don't have a choice to do anything. The world, and whether you think of it as randomness or however, the world acts in ways to keep choice from you. And order is the other extreme where things are so ordered and defined that it's almost like your choices are given to you. And so being in the middle is really where your intellect and you as a person can come to be, and you can decide what, and that's really where we function as humans.
Nice. So I do just want to close this off with a quick quote. It's kind of close to how he closes the chapter, but he's trying to define meaning, and in natural Peterson form, he goes like on for 2 pages trying to define meaning. So I'm just going to spare you guys and give you one paragraph. Meaning is when everything there is comes together in an ecstatic dance of a single purpose. The glorification of a reality that no matter how good it has suddenly become, it can get better and better and better, more and more deeply forever into the future. Meaning happens when that dance has become so intense that all the horrors of the past, all the terrible struggle engaged in by all of life and all of humanity to that moment becomes a necessary and worthwhile part of an increasingly successful attempt to build something truly mighty and good. And in there you can see the dream of the ultimate moral goal being the equilibrated state, a game that gets better as we play it, that sustains and or gets better every time we play it. And that should be the ultimate goal. And with that, do what is meaningful and not what is expedient.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger, Claire, and Sanjay. So now we'll go to the questions. We have 4 rules. Number 1, to ask questions, you can type a exclamation mark in the chat. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, be courteous. Feel free to disagree with anybody on anything, but be courteous in doing that. So it's going to be Stefan Hemrick first, then Joe, then Pegor. You can go ahead and line up for questions by just typing in exclamation mark. All right, Steve, go ahead.
Hi. Another figure that Jordan, I'm surprised, doesn't talk about in addition to Jesus is the Buddha, nor does he talk about Buddhism, and I imagine because he's a Christian, but life is suffering, dukkha is the first of the 4 noble truths of Buddhism, and there's samsara, which has to do with sacrifice in the afterlife and part of the Eightfold Path. So I'm wondering if he talks about that in any of his writing in Buddhism or the like.
So Peterson is all about Buddhism. It's all over the book. He really tries to bring in both Western and Eastern philosophy and religion. He doesn't call to it specifically in this chapter, except for in the second to last sentence. So, I mean, it's definitely there, in which he says, meaning is the way, capital W. And so, I mean, these stories are archetypal because they exist across so many religions. And I think we see this in Muhammad, we see this in the Buddha. I mean, there's so many different stories that call to the, sacrifice.
Okay, next up is Joe. So it's going to be Joe, Pegor, Bowden, Zeno, and Paul next. Joe, go ahead.
Hi, guys. Thank you again for presenting this evening. It was always amazing, as always, and I really appreciate it. You guys talked about the delayed gratification or the sacrifice and how that results in a certain amount of resilience, not only for the individual, but for society as a whole. So is the way we can derive what is meaningful through, basically managing our own personal desires or disciplining our own personal desires? Is that the mechanism that we can then determine meaning?
So that's more of like the first requirement. It's the idea of like first and like one of the lists, because he lists several things that you should do or that he thinks you should do, and one of the main ones is, well, understand yourself first, and that's kind of goes back to the integration of the shadow. Most people tend to have an idea of who they are. And they're pretty convinced that that's who they are, but it's also because everyone else around you isn't going to tell you what they really see or what they really think of you, right? So like we all have this concept, and it's like, well, you really have to first dig and find out what's actually in you, and that requires, one, you understand your own shadow, which is all the dark impulses you have, which then allows you to actually gain control of them, because if you don't understand them, then you can't act. But then two, it's also just in general being more aware and more, from the Jungian term, conscious about like what is going on in your body and what's actually happening. But by no means is that's where it stops. That's just a prerequisite before you can even attempt this, because otherwise what Peterson would say is that's where you get in the extreme left sense, where you're like, I'm going to help everybody. How? By like forcing everyone to do what I think is the right way to do it, right? So you got to really keep an eye out for that over exaggeration without self-reflection.
Thank you.
Next up is Pegor. Pegor, go ahead.
Hey, thank you guys for the presentation. I wanted to ask a question regarding this conversation that started after the Descartes point, where Peterson says that we know what absolute evil is, and we should go for the opposite. And I just couldn't help but remember Sam Harris's Moral Landscape, in which he sort of lays out a very similar argument that we can imagine an absolute worst reality, and so we can create this moral landscape of better worlds. And I just wanted to get your feedback. Am I going crazy? Because one's like very Christian and the other is like an atheist, and like here they are arguing from the same starting place. So it's like thoughts.
I mean, that's literally Peterson's entire point for, I think, like the first debate. Like he's just like your entire premise still requires a leap of faith, like, which Peterson's like, I have no problem doing that, but you can't say that like this is a purely rational theory if you're still presuming that humans have value. Like you can't make that presumption. There's no reason to make that presumption, logically speaking, right? For all, you could take the perspective that's like, we're actually a giant virus on this earth and we should all die, right? Like that actually probably be better for the world. So like you can't, like, you have to make the leap that humans do matter. We should, and once you make that, then everything else extends. Peterson gets that idea of humans do matter from the idea of the logos, that everyone has a spark of the divinity, and therefore everyone, no matter how reprehensible, should always be protected and valued. And he pins that to Christianity, but it's an extension from the Jewish tradition, which is an extension from the Egyptian tradition, and then Mesopotamia.
Next up is going to be Bowden, Zeno, Paul, and Jean. Bowden, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate Peterson's understanding of evil and fascism and communism, especially communism, which actually makes him unique in the modern university. So that's a positive point. What I find that he's lacking, he's doesn't really explicate or explain the postmodern and the current condition that our societies are exist in. That's really a failing. It's number two, he's very unspecific about meaning and values. That all of those two topics have a history. They start with the Greeks, with Aristotle, with Stoicism. They look at Christian values. He doesn't specify any of this. One lady talked about Buddhism and the Buddhist values. He talks generally. I think it's just a valedictorian speech. Be good, be better. to me, it doesn't address the postmodern condition, the death of meaning that Nietzsche identified. He doesn't go into these things. These are very, very serious problems in our society. The scientific ethos, consumerism, narcissism, individualism, he neglects all of these issues, which are serious issues. I mean, it's so nice. There is evil and be good. So that's it. That's all I see. Admit responsibility. Okay, but then that could be said in a high school valedictorian speech. So how do you address these comments?
Yeah, so I would say the first thing to understand from Peterson is coming at it from a psychological perspective. So what he's trying to address, like I mentioned earlier, he believes that ethics are biologically based, right? So therefore, the definition of exact axioms isn't a requirement because they function as an idea. So they're an emergent ethic. So it's not necessarily the idea of like, you need to do A, B, and C. If anything, he kind of points out that like, that's one of the biggest problems with morality, because what he believes morality is actually an abstraction of the dominance hierarchy as far as game strategies that function within a dominance hierarchy that function in a way that's sustainable. And that's what he believes morality actually is, which means it's already embedded within us and it gets articulated under people that aren't pathological. But the idea is that you have to aim for the highest good and then follow your meaning. So to get more technical on what he means by meaning, because he does go way into this, is the idea. So Peterson believes that we have we function within two different maps: the map of where we are, and the map of what the future could hold. And anytime we have an anomaly in that map, we detect it. Let me see how I can explain it. Anytime you have an experience where something's extremely unexpected, or even just remotely unexpected, the reaction you have of panic and curiosity at the same time, he believes that that's actually a way in which we seek out, it's an orienting reflex. That's why he's obsessed with it. But he believes that that's actually one way that we can find meaning, and we can find meaning in a positive sense. So that would be the negative sense where it's like we have an anomaly and we don't know how to deal with it. In a positive sense, would be, hey, you're acquiring enough information that it's actually going to be beneficial for you because you're expanding your capacity while at the same time still feeling secure. So he sees it as an actual biological emergent property of human beings that we have that ethic. But the point for this book, and the reason it's a little bit more surface level, is because he also sees it reflected directly on a lot of our myths, and that's his point.
Let me add one more thing here. I think his view of values is very different from the Greek view of values or the subjectivist view of values. The Greek view of values, or even like the Christian view of values, is that these are the values, pursue these particular things. He's not saying that. The subjectivist view is that you can't really, there's no such thing as value, do whatever you feel like, okay? What he's saying is that try to conceptualize what you think is your highest value and actually try to pursue it. And in the process of pursuing it, you will discover the value. So it is an inductive way of figuring out your values through action. So it is kind of closer to the pragmatics, the pragmatist view of values. Okay, next one up is Zeno. Zeno, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to be after Bowden because I also was disappointed in this chapter. I felt it was a potted history of Christian struggle of a high school student who discovers Nietzsche and then adds a little bit here and there. So my question is, how would like Hitler respond to say, find meaning? I mean, he would say, I found meaning. This is my meaning. I'm deeply embedded in this. This is my value, and I'm living my meaning. and even the lowly person who draw the bodies from the gas chambers in Auschwitz, he could have been happy in his life and go to a little classical concert that the prisoners gave in a side alley. So this whole idea, the summit of the advice is to find meaning. How did that get any traction on denouncing Nazism and the Nuremberg Trials?
Yeah, so for example, that's why the Cain and Abel story keeps coming up. It's the idea that like so for Peterson's view, you can define meaning in a lot of different ways. And what it is that you value is what defines essentially what you perceive. So that's why that warning from the Cain and Abel story is there, is if you're a failed artist who tried really hard and believed that he was good enough to make it and then wasn't, that resentment can very quickly lead to a downward spiral, right? Like these aren't, it's more important to understand the fact that Hitler was human, like every single one of us. And the perspective that Jung and Peterson and even I personally hold is every single one of us could actually be that person. We all could be the next Hitler, right? Like, and if you don't understand that about yourself, that's the first thing. But the idea is picking one person and saying, it's like, well, what about them? It's like, no, that's actually an example of how things could go wrong. But the fact that those people exist is if anything, a warning for why we do need to aim for the highest good, why we do need to quite quickly designate, okay, what's the thing we don't want to end up being like that guy? Okay, well, what's the exact opposite of that guy? All right, well, in this direction, or, in a symbolic reason, like looking up, right? So the idea is like, as you move towards it, you get better at it, and you get better at finding something that can justify the life. And more importantly, you're trying to improve life. It's the main premise.
Folks, what we're going to do is that, Zeno, what we are going to do is that we are going to go to breakout rooms. And after the breakout rooms, you will have a full chance to make a full statement of doing the takeaways. This time we're just doing kind of clarificatory questions. Then we'll do the detailed discussions in the breakout room, and then we will come back. I want to get as many questions in as possible, and then we will discuss these things in great amount of detail in the takeaway session. Okay. Next up is going to be last two questions. We got Paul J. and then Jean. Paul, go ahead.
Right. Thanks for a talk today. It's been first time enjoying joining here, so quite experience. So my question, I've been tracing down Jordan Peterson's video for quite a bit, and it echoes a lot what you're saying, and it was great. Question was, I was thinking of the future, that if we all acted out in the manner that we all capable of understanding our own good and evil capacity, etc. Let's say we all clean our rooms and act out in a meaningful way, not expedient. And I was keep thinking of how the society would look like, because society, our hierarchical system in our brain and hormone, they're all quite relative to what's happening around us. So say, if you are high in a hierarchy, you are very likely to have a high serotonin, and vice versa. And even if like someone do their best and actually reach to the very top level, and there's always be someone who's better than them, right? So it sounds like if we acted out in such a manner, if everyone does it, which is quite far from the reality that we have now, but it sounds like quite raising a bar high. So let's say, and so in that sense, Peterson always warning and contending about the idea of utopia, because that's quite leading us into communism idea. So yeah, I was wondering, what if we acted out in such Jordan Peterson advised us to do, and would that happen?
It's a great question, because he certainly also advises against the possibility of equality of outcomes, right? The possibility that everyone could have a utopian existence and we could all pursue meaning and everyone would be equal and happy, and that's just not rational. And I think that what he would propose is that along that hierarchy, you have your individual ladder, you know, and that there can be flow experiences of all levels. And so creating the meaning, and this goes back to comparing yourself to who you were yesterday, is figure out what that ladder is for yourself. And it's not all going to be to celebrity level or NBA level. But if you know what your ladder is and your strengths and weaknesses are, then we can have a society with different hierarchies. Hopefully a healthy middle class would help a lot. But everyone, you know, can climb a ladder of their own making.
Okay, we'll take one more question and then we'll go to breakout rooms, and then everybody will be able to give their own takeaway after the discussion. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, so actually I really like this chapter, and especially the part they're talking about meaning. I agree, you know, even though it's very abstract, but somehow it makes a lot of sense to me, especially they're talking about when you have meaning, actually connect the past and the future and now all together. And it reminds me about, you know, the Taoism, you know, like the Tao, talking about the Tao, the nature law. You know, I was always thinking that's how everybody is searching. Basically, if we understand that, then we can live an effortless life and happiness, you know, all this could come together. So I think the question is, you know, everybody have very different meaning. And, you know, I guess we can all do our own search through different routes. Yeah, I agree. It's not very clear. I guess, but I totally understand Jordan Peterson, through my own experience, his suggestion about doing what you can the best, because I come from China. So originally is a socialist country. And I come here, have a great hope for a free country. And I was a little bit disappointed after I live here for 18 years. And I realized this capitalism is just a different form. The essence is very similar to so-called socialism. Sounds like, oh, I want to move to Europe, you know. That's where the real ideal society is. People have more like, you know, the middle class people have more say and all this. Then I talked with some other friend who actually moved from Europe to America. And she is Malaysia Chinese. And she said the reason she moved here because she met people who second generation Malaysia Chinese, whatever, in Sweden, but they still feel like outsider. So that's the reason she gave up everything. Like she could retire in that country, but she gave up everything so her kids could feel like she's part of the country. So she started all over again in America. So it just, you know, through that I realized there's no ideal society. We're always trying to go somewhere, you know, where everything is perfect and ready for us to live. But just like Jordan Peterson said, you know, we have to do what we can, even though it's not ideal society. Maybe it's close to compared to other countries, you know, at least there's a chance we can make it better. So I think from that point, my own experience, I realized that's really makes sense in reality. You know, we still don't have a formula how to do it, but maybe the minimum we can do is make a little bit better than yesterday, I guess.
Yeah, one of the ways that Peterson put it once that I really liked is, what life would you have to live so that if life was meaningless otherwise and nothing else ever mattered, the life that you lived would be good enough?
Okay, on that note, let's do breakout rooms. We'll be doing breakout rooms for about 25 minutes, and then we'll automatically come here to share our takeaways. And then each person will have 2 to 3 minutes to talk about everything that they think about this chapter. All right, folks, I'm starting the breakout rooms now.